Welcome back to another episode on Front Row. Today we're in conversation with someone who is very well known in the economic research field and the think tank space. We have with us Dr. Nishan De Mel, who is the Executive Director at Verite Research. Pleasure to have you on the show. A few questions I think we'll try to cover within this short span of time for our viewers. Historically, I think we've seen the economy has been opportunities to break its vicious cycles, to put it in that perspective, and move away from it and maybe deliver on the potential that the economy has always seen. How in this particular cycle, how can Sri Lanka really move away from these boom and bust cycles?
Thank you, Shiran. It's a really good question, because every time we have a growth spurt, we believe that now we are in a new trajectory and things are going to be different, but we end up in a cycle. And our own analysis is that many of Sri Lanka's growth spurts, I'm not only referring to the last 10 years, I'm referring to last 30, 40 years even, have been driven by less structural changes and more superficial changes. So what we've done is we have really used the easy instruments we have, which is monetary policy, fiscal policy, to drive growth by expanding the trade deficit and expanding the fiscal deficit alternatively, and then coming into the bust cycle when we have to tighten our belts to avoid an exchange rate problem, an interest rate problem, or an inflation problem. Let me give you a simple example. When you analyze growth 2010 onwards, what you see is that much of the growth was driven by either imported consumption, which is not really a structural aspect of improved productivity or growth, or it was driven by government-funded construction, which again then puts pressure on the deficit and debt and interest and inflation, so on and so forth. So really, our recipe is to look at the structural issues. The structural issues that are being dealt with now is one, why can't we get exports to do better? And that's not just a matter of improving or getting into trade agreements, it's also resolving the bottlenecks and problems exporters face in the country. Why is agriculture productivity so low? 28% of the labor force produce 8% of GDP. That really requires us to come into the modern age, both in terms of manufacture, transport, processing, all of which our neighbors and other Asian countries are overtaking us, and Sri Lanka is being left behind. So I just want to leave you a couple of examples and not talk at length, but it's the structural issues that perhaps get less attention because the quick fixes are on the superficial side.
Sure. Your institution is credited with putting out a lot of thought-provoking analysis, reports, and a recent one over at least in the last 12 months has been this budget tracker, which has really given a metric and got that conversation which generally happens at a more boardroom level in terms of implementation to someone in the public who can now understand and see what is actually being implemented. How important do you think are these tools in driving conversation to make it more broad-based? And what have been some of the interesting learnings that you've had from these kind of trackers or these kind
Thank you very much. We call them platforms, and we call them kind of public platforms that then help everybody who's brought into the platform. So, for instance, we have a platform called Mantri.lk that puts parliamentarians and their performance on a stage for the public to understand, and the budget tracker does that with budget and its implementation. We think that it generates something that we call answerability, which is a fundamentally important aspect of democracy. You can't solve everything by going to courts, by suing people or having investigations. Public sector and politicians have discretion, and they must be answerable to how they use that discretion. So classically what we found in 2010 onwards is that the budget has promised enormous amounts of money in it for agriculture. But often less than 20, 30, 40, 50% of it was spent. So people are misunderstanding what politicians are doing, and that enables the political and bureaucratic system to perpetuate, policies and actions that are not in keeping with the promises they make, which is what they get elected for. So really, platforms like this drive but public accountability through asking the question why, being much clearer about what has happened. And we think Sri Lanka is fundamentally democratic in that sense. When there is a strong conversation about something happens. I'll end with an example. For 20 years in this country, since 1994 or 5, we've been trying to get electronic documents and it hasn't worked. Since 2006, we've even had legislation that allows electronic signatures. So Verite came in 2016 and created a conversation to say, here's the law is applicable, there's no impediment to electronic signatures, why has it not happened? And I think it is the power of that conversation amongst people who understood the facts more easily and simply that then helped to generate action, which was otherwise being resisted for obvious reasons, because not having electronic document processing leaves room for leakages in other ways. So we think that these platforms are foundational part of a good democracy at work, and that they can help us to actually generate outcomes from a system that otherwise has vested interests that might prevent the better outcomes coming. Thanks.
So shifting tracks onto something a bit more dicey and a bit more, I guess you need to have a enormous conversation on its own. I think in terms of the private sector and public at large, the worry about will we face electricity shortages in the next few years. Briefly, I know this is a topic that you're very knowledgeable and passionate also about. Briefly, will we face these kind of challenges?
So I think the challenge that we face will come if the Ceylon Electricity Board fails to implement the plans that are in place. And sometimes our planning has been so weak that we plan to fail. Because, for instance, when you plan another coal power plant in Sampur, you create not only a crisis, a local crisis, so nobody wants coal in this country, and only Norochale, Sampur and Hambantota are appropriate places. Secondly, our power is in difficulty and costly because we get into poor contracts on private-public partnerships. Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize-winning economist when he was here in 2015, famously reminded us of something he says about private-public partnerships in countries like Sri Lanka, that it is a great way, partnership, because the public sector takes all the rest and the private sector takes all the profit. But really it's not just that all contracting is likely to be compromised by weak negotiation and problems that are inherent in countries like ours. So the problem is not to get into the solution is not to get into private-public partnerships, it's to have a better public sector. But that's where the platforms come in and the answerability comes in. We have to fix the system. There is no shortcut way out of it.
Thank you, Dr. Nishan. I think that was a very stimulating conversation, which will probably open a few more questions for our viewers, but also clarify certain things in terms of the cycles, the need to break it, what platforms such as the ones I've introduced has really steered the conversation and driven the change that is actually required. And in terms of energy, I know Dr. Nishan didn't answer whether we'll face electricity shortages, but he gave insights as to the problem. And I think that was quite insightful as well. So to our viewers, stay tuned for episodes like this, where we talk with eminent personalities to get the latest on the economy.